Okay, please take your seats. Please silence your cell phones. Let me check mine. Good, on vibrate. Okay, thank you all for coming to the 16th Jacques Polak Annual Research Conference. I'm Maurice Obstfeld, Economic Counselor and Director of Research here at the IMF. Over the course of many more years than I care to remember, I've had the privilege of participating in this prestigious conference on various occasions, but always as a guest. And I have to say that was much easier than having to organize it, and I didn't even do most of the work. Jokes aside, I'm truly delighted to be here in my new role as head of research. The Annual Research Conference, or the ARC, as we call it, is a very special forum that brings top researchers and policymakers from around the world to the fund to exchange views in a rigorous way on key economic policy issues. Our goal is to gain a deeper understanding of today's policy challenges, of the mechanisms at play, and the tools available to policymakers. This year's theme is unconventional monetary and exchange rate policies, obviously very topical. With the exception of Japan, advanced economies rarely experienced persistent deflationary pressures in the post-war period up until the global financial crisis. And so they were rarely confronted with challenges posed by the zero lower bound on nominal interest rates. Then the global financial crisis came along and created a common deflationary impulse across a range of economies, an impulse that we're still feeling to this day. Rapidly reaching the zero lower bound and no longer able to conduct conventional policy by lowering short-term interest rates, major central banks resorted to quantitative easing and forward guidance in support of their policy goals. 7 years after, short-term nominal interest rates remain at zero or even below in many countries, and unconventional monetary policies are still in place, something I think very few of us would have predicted back when those policies were adopted. And despite the long track record now, the effects of these policies remain subjects of debate. All the more so as some central banks, having long ago exhausted their conventional ammunition and with little or no support from their fiscal authorities, seem ready to push unconventional policies even further. There's little consensus not only about the effectiveness of UMP, unconventional monetary policy, in promoting aggregate demand, but also about the possible unintended side effects, for example, on financial stability or on the distribution of income. The extent of spillovers to other economies and their desirability from a global perspective is also uncertain and the subject of heated debate, and we'll be hearing a lot about that today. Attempting to cope with the effects of both the global adopted many of their own unconventional credit and foreign exchange policies. Again, the effectiveness of these policies remains subject to debate, as do the merits of global policy coordination in the zero lower bound environment. With monetary policies in major currency areas now headed in opposite directions, the profession also faces another challenge, that of understanding the risks of policy normalization and monetary policy divergence, both for the major advanced economies and for the emerging and developing world. Okay, let me say a few words about the conference program. We have 13 excellent papers and high caliber discussants, and they'll be talking about these issues and others over the course of the next couple of days. I expect we'll have very lively discussions on some key questions. Among those, and again, this is just a proper subset, how quickly should the US tighten monetary policy and exit from QE? How can central bank balance sheets eventually be normalized? Is the neutral real rate lower than before the crisis? And if so, what does that say about optimal inflation targets? Are we entering an environment of global deflation? And if so, is the existing central bank toolkit going to be adequate to the challenge? Should governments seriously consider monetary financing of fiscal deficits, long a taboo, when they're confronted with seemingly intractable deflationary pressures, and what might be the longer-run drawbacks of such a strategy. As in previous years, today's Mundell-Fleming lecture promises to be very illuminating and squarely on the topics that will motivate the papers. The speaker is Ben Bernanke, as I'm sure you all know, former chairman of the Fed, and he will focus on the effects of U.S. monetary policy on emerging markets, including so-called currency wars, financial spillovers, and the role of the dollar. And tomorrow, the conference will wrap up with a policy panel made up of Claudio Borio, head of the Monetary and Economic Department at the BIS, Governor Lael Brainerd of the Federal Reserve, Paul Krugman of CUNY, New York, and the New York Times, and Adam Posen, the president of the Peterson Institute. I'm certain we'll have lively and enriching debates throughout the conference, and we'll learn a lot from our visitors and also from the questions that come from the floor. So I'll encourage you to not be shy about coming up to these microphones when question and answer period starts. If you can't make it in person and are somehow watching me from afar, the papers and presentations will be available online, and you can watch the webcast of the Mundell-Fleming lecture and the policy panel called the Economic Forum at www.imf.org. If you are a Twitter person, you can also follow the conference on Twitter at hashtag ArcPolak. With that, welcome again, and let's turn to our first session on the theory behind the use of the central bank balance sheet as a policy instrument.